Welcome to Friday night's video in our Master Series. This is the 11th video in our Master Series and the fifth video in our recording phase of this series. Now, there's a couple things I want to address. If you've gone back and watched the first video in the recording phase of this series, that you basically have an understanding of the most important aspects you need to take into consideration to get a really good capture. Now, we're getting ready to go in the recording process, but first of all, there's a couple things I want to address that are very pertinent. There are a few different situations, and you may run into some more, and you're going to have to work your way through them. But the first consideration is you're either recording a direct instrument in, a keyboard or a guitar or whatever, directly lined into your interface or mixer or whatever. You are recording a VST instrument and recording it either MIDI or you're recording it, into as audio, and or you're capturing from a microphone, a vocal, or you're trying to capture from an amplifier or something like that. Those are the most usual things that I see people run into in the studio. And this is a very simple concept that when you are running directly line in, listen for issues. Are you having problems? When it's run directly line in, you have to act like it's just a microphone, like it's a microphone. Deal with it just like it's a microphone. And don't see it any other way. And same with the VST instrument. Just like you're capturing from a microphone, and what things you need to take in consideration to get that good capture. And if you watch that first video, you understand what you're basically looking for. And besides that, you'd just be looking for, problems. Problems with the instrument, how it's set up, the patch it might be using, the pickup it might be using, whatever might be the problem. It needs strings, it needs to be in tune, it's whatever you need to do, deal with it. It's not that big of an issue. It's not this huge thing you have to deal with that makes you think you have to go to NASA to make that, to make that connection. Don't make it something so complicated. Keep it really simple in your mind. Listen for problems. If there are problems, go back to the instrument and find out what the problem is. Does that make sense? And figure out and fix the problem. So when you're coming directly in or from the VST, what is the problem? Is it the patch? You didn't set it up correctly? You don't know how to use the synthesizer that well? There's part of it that it's making a sound you don't like that you need to fix? That you need to deal with that at that point. That's normally not too bad of an issue. Microphones can be a huge issue because I'll tell you a pretty good example to give you is you've got Bob the Sportscaster. Now, Bob the Sportscaster, he's got this little teeny microphone that sits on his front of his face with these headphones on, and he sounds awesome, dude. You're sitting there listening on your big hi-fi TV, and he sounds great. His voice sounds great. His dynamics sound great. The whole dang thing sounds great. Why? Because they've set the microphone so far away, not too close, not too far, and they probably put an EQ on there. They've put some type of reverberation, spatialization to give it a little bit of body, and they've put probably some compression on it so that it doesn't get serious dynamic spikes, all over the place, like I talked to you about in the first video. So you got good dynamics, but you don't get clipping and distortion and lose harmonic content. And it's that simple because he sounds awesome. It's not some huge project. You've got a microphone. I'll normally start out with it 6 to 8 inches away from the face. The capsule points in a certain direction. That doesn't mean you put it off somewhere off to the side somewhere else. It's supposed to be pointed at the source that you're trying to capture. It's a pretty simple concept. 6 to 8 inches, and then start bringing up the input, the volume of it, until it sounds about right. Does that make sense? Sometimes you might have to move it back a little bit farther if the guy's like screaming lunatic or something, but most of the time not. You can get some pretty good dynamics, somewhere between 6 to 8 inches. Sometimes I'll go back a foot, maybe sometimes even a foot and a half, but then you start capturing room noise. If you put a seashell up to your ear, you're shh. You get too far away and you start cranking the input gain, you'll be able to hear the neighbor from 6 blocks away and him listening to the seashell. Shh. Does that make sense? And you want to avoid that. So it's a pretty simple concept that initial capture like that, you're capturing sound. Now, if you want to capture room acoustics, basically you got an overhead or something like that, or another microphone that's farther away, or a bunch of microphones. Now, basically those are going to be added in underneath the initial capture. And what those are going to act like, just like a convolution reverb, that's going to be adding ambience and the actual texture of the space that you want him to sound like he's in. And you can add that into various degrees, just like using those captures in in various degrees, just like if you were using a convolution reverb. And it has his voice on it or the sound you're trying to capture as well. So, I mean, it's the same type of concept. But that simple concept of using the microphone isn't that simple. It's supposed to be pointing in a certain direction. You can start out 6 to 8 inches away. You might have to move back a little bit, you know, put a pop filter on there if you're dealing with a person so they don't go up on the microphone and go way far away, so that they, you know, stay consistent in sound if they don't know how to use the microphone really well. And you know, get the capture. You know, I mean, if you're recording from an amplifier, you may sometimes find yourself trying to scoot up closer because of it trying to capture sounds of the sound coming out the back, of too much reverberation or spatialization, and it's starting to sound too muddy, or it's getting too much ambience, and you're trying to get close up on the speaker, so you try to eliminate the reverberations from the room. And we talked about that and taking the room into consideration, that your amplifier, that stuff bouncing around, is going to do the same thing. And I see some people try to ride way up on the amplifier trying to eliminate that. Does that make sense? Or make it sound like they're eliminating. Basically what it is they're hoping it'll drown it out, but that doesn't really work. Does that make sense? I mean, the concept is it's still going to come back and hit the microphone, you know, but they don't think it is, so they keep scooting it up on top of there. Or they scoot up real close because they're trying to not turn the volume up real loud to catch noise. Shh. Does that make sense? And that can be a concept. But the use of the microphone is very simple. There's a whole series on this channel about using the microphone, or about the microphone itself, and I suggest you watch it because the basic concept of using it is very simple. You know, you want to get a good capture. The guy on the sportscasting thing, more than likely, even in that microphone, he doesn't sound that good underneath from the initial capture. So basically, they're putting equalization, reverberation, compression on there before you hear it. And then it sounds great, right? But if you had him all by himself and he was just using that capture, and it's probably a pretty dang good microphone, bro, that, you know, it doesn't sound that good until they've done some processing on it. So take that into consideration when you're miking stuff, because when you go do your processing and things like that, that you're going to do work on it. Sound sculpting, equalization, reverberations, compressions and expansion, or compressions, things like that, to make it sound as good as possible. Because the initial capture, you're going to try to get as good a capture you can with the microphone, but it might not sound like Whitney Houston at the premiere until you've done some dang work on it, even if it was Whitney Houston singing into the microphone. Okay, so you really have to take that into consideration and just use it the way it's supposed to be used. You know, it's very simple deal. Don't make it confusing. Don't make it really, you know, complicated to where, you know, it becomes a NASA problem. You start dealing with a bunch of different microphones and different things. All of a sudden you got phase problems, all kinds of stuff, you know, that, you know, you're having to deal with. You know, that you've caused the problem yourself, rather than just getting a good capture and knowing that, just like the sportscaster guy and the engineers there, they're going to be doing some work on it, whether it's Whitney Houston or Bob the lunatic that lives downstairs, to where either one of them sound great. You know, I mean, does that make sense? So really keep that in mind. Just use it properly, like I was trying to say there, and start out like that. I mean, if you go with that you'll probably be okay, and just know that you're going to have to work on it later. Other things about using this microphone here, and then you got another one off to the side. It's like I've got this microphone, and up front, this guy's lisp is really in the thing. So I've moved it off to the side some because it makes the lisp thing go away. These are experimentations using the microphone. It's like recording a snare drum. You might do the same thing. Right on, it might be catching some other sound or something not quite right that it sounds if you step back and listen to snare drum. So you're trying to angle it or something to try to get it to sound right. You know, does that make sense? And that is just an experimentation. As you get better at that you'll use your microphones better. And when you record people, when you get microphones you're comfortable with, how they work, how they function, and things like that, that, you know, what's the best way to use it in that circumstance, you know, that it's pretty simple. And it's normally not a, you know, a NASA project for you to get a good capture. You know, just use the microphone properly, use it how it was designed, and stick around that and think more about the processing that you're going to do to Howard Cosell's voice later, so he sounds just like he did on ESPN Live. Does that make sense? Don't worry about, without all that processing, he might not have sounded like the Bob Cosell guy that you're used to hearing, because it sounds like you talking into the microphone and your bad capture, or the capture you thought was bad, until they processed it correctly for you to hear it, so it sounds as good as possible. So really keep that in mind. So we've talked about having to draw direct input and dealing with that, dealing with the VST and the microphone issue, so that that's out of the way, and just worry about getting as good a capture as possible and getting the things done that I talked about in the first video in this recording phase, the recording phase 1 video, the most important things to get as good a capture as possible, and just use the microphone correctly. Use the instrument that you're running directly in correctly. Use the VST that you're trying to capture correctly. Use it correctly, set it up well, and then go to work. Get the good capture. Then worry about the other aspects of it, and we'll talk about that in the recording phase. So the next video, we're going to actually just go through the recording phase, because after you've watched all these videos on this recording, and there's going to be probably 6 or 7 of them, that the actual recording process is not that difficult, and you want to keep it as simple as possible, but you want to get as good a capture as possible. And I'm trying to talk about these things as we go along, so you don't get wrapped up in things and get lost in things, and end up with NASA problems when you're just trying to capture Howard Cosell or do an album, that, it's not that difficult. So peace, hope, love. I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you go watch that series on synthesizers and the series on microphones, so that you have a better idea of what you're dealing with in the recording process. And I'll see you in the next video when we go through the recording process itself and get that awesome capture that we were talking about in the first phase of the recording in this series.